The killer cabbie, Christopher Halliwell. The sickening tactic that almost let a serial killer walk free. The murders of Becky Godden Edwards and Shauna Callahan. Swindon, England, 2003 to 2011. A full documentary account. Introduction. The deal that should never have been made. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 24th of March, 2011, a senior detective stood with a suspected murderer in a field in Oxfordshire, England. Around them, officers waited at a distance. The Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher of Wiltshire Police, had just watched this man, a taxi driver from Swindon named Christopher Halliwell, lead them to the body of a young woman named Shauna Callahan, who had been missing for 6 days. It was a result Fulcher had desperately needed. But instead of ending the encounter there, as the law required, Halliwell asked if Fulcher wanted another one. Fulcher said yes. What followed was one of the most important, most debated, and most disturbing sequences of events in the modern history of British criminal justice. Halliwell led detectives to a second location, a field in Gloucestershire, and showed them where he had buried the remains of a young woman named Becky Godden Edwards, who had been missing since 2003. 2 murders, 2 graves, 1 afternoon. And then, in the move that gives this case its lasting infamy, Halliwell made clear, through his subsequent silence, exactly what he had done. He had used the second confession as a deliberate tactic. He had handed over Becky Godden not out of remorse, not out of guilt, but because he understood, even in that moment of apparent openness, that by leading police to a second body without being formally cautioned, he was potentially making all of that evidence legally unusable. His sickening tactic, as it was later called by commentators and legal observers, was to contaminate the investigation at its source. He was right. When the case came to court, the judge ruled that Halliwell confessions were inadmissible, obtained in breach of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, which requires that a suspect be formally cautioned and given access to a solicitor before being questioned. The charge of murdering Becky Godden Edwards was dropped. Halliwell pleaded guilty only to the murder of Shauna Callahan, the case for which independent DNA evidence existed, and received a life sentence with a 25-year minimum. For Becky Godden's family, there was no justice. For Becky herself, there was no acknowledgement in any courtroom of the fact of her murder. It took 5 more years, painstaking detective work by a new team, and a spade with the right soil on it before Christopher Halliwell finally faced a second conviction. This is a full story of who he was, who his victims were, what he did, how he almost escaped accountability, and how justice, delayed and incomplete, but real, eventually arrived. Christopher Halliwell, the man behind the wheel early life in criminal history. Christopher John Halliwell was born in 1964 in Swindon, Wiltshire, an industrial town in the southwest of England that had grown up around the Great Western Railway works. He grew up in modest circumstances and, from a relatively early age, showed a tendency toward criminal behavior. As a young man in the 1980s, Halliwell committed a series of burglaries and served time in prison at HMP Dartmoor. It was during this period of imprisonment that those who later examined his background found the first unsettling evidence of his inner world. A fellow prisoner named Ernest Springer, interviewed by police after Halliwell's 2011 arrest, told the Sun newspaper that even as a young prisoner, Halliwell had been fascinated by violence and the idea of killing. Springer said Halliwell used to ask him about killing, and showed an unusual preoccupation with notorious murder cases. Halliwell's favorite book, according to those who knew him, was about the Moors murders, the case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who killed 5 children in the 1960s, burying some of their victims on Saddleworth Moor. Hindley's face appeared on the book's cover. After his release from prison, Halliwell worked various jobs, eventually becoming a taxi driver in Swindon. It was a profession that gave him almost ideal conditions for what investigators believe he was already planning and beginning to do: late-night access to women traveling alone. The trust that comes with being a licensed cab driver, knowledge of the roads and rural areas surrounding Swindon, and a legitimate reason to be anywhere at any hour without arousing suspicion. He had a long-term partner and was known to his neighbors and colleagues as quiet and unremarkable. He was a keen fisherman and narrowboat enthusiast, pastime that gave him further familiarity with remote, rural waterways around the English countryside. Investigators later believed that this knowledge of remote locations was not incidental to his crimes but central to them. He knew where bodies could be hidden. He knew which fields and hedgerows and riverbanks were quiet enough and remote enough that a burial might go unnoticed for years. The trophy store. After Halliwell's arrest, police investigating the case discovered a pond at a location in Ramsbury, Wiltshire. In that pond, hidden beneath the water, was a cache of women's clothing, jewelry, and personal accessories. In total, investigators retrieved approximately 60 items. Not all could be identified, but what they represented was unmistakable. Halliwell had been keeping trophies, items taken from women he had encountered, women who may have been victims he had killed, or women he had assaulted in other ways. The sheer volume of the collection, 60 pieces, was one of the most disturbing discoveries of the entire case, because it suggested strongly that the two murders for which Halliwell was eventually convicted were far from the full extent of his crimes. The pond had not been properly investigated until 2014, 3 years after Halliwell's arrest. By then, as the Independent Office of Police Conduct later noted, the items had degraded and lost much of their forensic potential. It was yet another example, in a case full of them, of investigative failure compounding the original crime. The first victim, Becky Gordon Edwards, a young woman in Swindon. Rebecca Becky Gordon Edwards was born on the 12th of June, 1982 in Swindon. She grew up in the town and, by the time she reached her late teens and early 20s, had become involved in drug use that put her in an extremely vulnerable position. She worked as a sex worker in the Swindon area, a fact that, as her mother Karen Edwards has spoken about repeatedly and with great anger in the years since her daughter's death, meant that when Becky went missing, the institutional response was slower and less urgent than it would have been for other young women. Becky was last seen alive in January 2003, getting into a taxi outside a Swindon nightclub after a night out with friends. She was 20 years old. When she did not come home and did not contact her family in the days that followed, those close to her reported her missing. The report generated some investigation, but Becky's circumstances, the drug use, the sex work, the chaotic life that addiction produces, meant assumptions were made about where she might have gone. She was not the subject of a sustained search. She had simply vanished, and the systems around her did not pursue her disappearance with the intensity it deserved. Becky Gordon Edwards was buried in a field in Gloucestershire, in a shallow grave in open farmland. She lay there for 8 years. Her mother Karen never stopped looking, never stopped asking questions, never stopped refusing to accept that her daughter had simply drifted away into the background of a life no one cared enough to follow. Karen Edwards became, in the years that followed the case's resolution, one of the most vocal and most respected advocates for the victims of Christopher Halliwell, and for changing the laws that had allowed him to escape accountability for so long. What the evidence later showed. In the early hours of the 3rd of January, 2003, around the time when Becky Gordon Edwards is believed to have died, Christopher Halliwell was recorded by the RAC breakdown service attending to a broken-down vehicle 6 miles from the field where Becky had been buried. On the same date, Halliwell visited his GP and was found to have severe scratches to his face and an injury to his hand. He told his doctor he had been assaulted by a passenger in his taxi. These were significant pieces of evidence. They placed Halliwell in the area at the time of the murder. They documented injuries consistent with a struggle, but they were not connected and properly investigated at the time. The RAC record was known to police in 2011, but a detailed account from the RAC driver was only obtained years later. The GP evidence was discovered only when investigators looked more carefully, years after Halliwell's arrest. Together, they formed exactly the kind of independent corroborating trail that investigators eventually needed to build a second prosecution, but they were not assembled quickly enough to prevent years of delay. The second victim, Shauna Callahan. Shauna Callahan was 22 years old, an office worker from Swindon, and, by every account of those who knew and loved her, a warm, vivid, much-loved young woman. She had a boyfriend named Kevin Reap, a close circle of friends, and a life that was, on the night of Friday the 18th of March, 2011, entirely normal and entirely full of the ordinary joys of being 22 in a town you know, with people you love around you. That night, Sean went out with friends to Suju nightclub in Swindon's Old Town. She drank, she danced, she enjoyed the evening. In the early hours of Saturday the 19th of March, 2011, she left the club alone at approximately 2:50 in the morning to make her own way home. She did not arrive. Her boyfriend Kevin raised the alarm when she failed to come home, and within days, Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher of Wiltshire Police was leading a major investigation. CCTV footage from the Old Town area of Swindon showed Sean walking, and then, critically, getting into a taxi. The taxi was a green Toyota Avensis with taxi markings. Analysis of the footage and records from that area eventually identified the vehicle. It was registered to Christopher Halliwell. Sean's mobile phone had connected to a mast near Savernake Forest, east of Swindon, in the period after she got into the taxi. Police organized extensive public searches of the forest area. Hundreds of volunteers turned out. The search was intensive, public, and urgent. Shauna Callahan was a young woman with a family who were openly, visibly distraught. Her boyfriend and parent appeared in emotional press appeals, and her case generated the kind of national attention and community mobilization that, by the sad arithmetic of the media, not all missing women receive equally. The contrast between the response to Sean's disappearance and the response to Becky Godden's disappearance 8 years earlier is one of the most uncomfortable facts in the entire case. It is not comfortable to say that a young office worker with a boyfriend and a photogenic appearance generated more institutional urgency than a vulnerable young woman working as a sex worker and struggling with addiction. But it is true, and the families of both women, and Karen Edwards specifically, have said it directly and publicly. The difference did not make Sean's death more of a tragedy than Becky's. It reflected a failure in how society and its institutions value different lives. Part 4. The arrest, a decision that changed everything Barbary Castle. By Thursday, the 24th of March, 2011, 6 days after Sean's disappearance, surveillance teams have been following Christopher Halliwell. His behavior had drawn increasing concern, and when the observation team assessed that he might be a suicide risk, the decision was made to arrest him. Officers stopped Halliwell in the car park of an Asda supermarket in North Swindon. His green Toyota Avensis taxi was seized. This was the moment at which, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, PACE, a formal, legally defined procedure should have taken over. Halliwell should have been driven to Gable Cross Police Station, cautioned, "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court," offered access to a solicitor, and interviewed under formal recorded conditions. These protections exist not as luxuries for suspects, but as fundamental safeguards that ensure any evidence obtained is legally reliable and cannot later be challenged in court. Detective Superintendent Fulcher made a different decision. He later explained it as a decision driven by the single overwhelming priority in his mind. Shauna Callahan might still be alive. If there was any chance she were being held somewhere, every minute mattered. He could not wait for the formal process. He ordered that Halliwell, instead of being taken to police station, be brought to Barbary Castle, an Iron Age hill fort on the Marlborough Downs, in the countryside outside Swindon. There, Fulcher met Halliwell alone and began talking to him, offering cigarettes, trying to build connection that might produce the one thing Fulcher needed, the location of Shauna Callahan. By his own admission, Fulcher knew this was a breach of PACE. He knew it was not what the rules required. He made a decision anyway, in the belief, a belief that many people who later assessed the case shared, including Becky's mother Karen, that saving a life outweighed a procedural requirement. It was a decision made with the best possible immediate motive, and it had consequences that Fulcher, for all his experience, may not have fully anticipated. Do you want another one? Eventually, after a long conversation on the hill fort, Halliwell agreed to take Fulcher to the body of Shauna Callahan. They drove together to a location near Uffington, Oxfordshire. Sean's body was found in a shallow grave. She was dead. She had, the pathologist would later determine, likely died from head injuries. The search for a missing person had become a murder investigation. This was the point at which, legally, the formal PACE procedure should have been applied without any further delay. Halliwell should now have been cautioned. He should have been told he did not have to say anything. He should have been offered a solicitor. The extraordinary nature of what had just happened, the discovery of a murder victim's body, made the formal protections even more important, not less. Instead, as Halliwell was being driven back from the site, he indicated to Fulcher that there was more. He asked if Fulcher wanted another one. Fulcher said yes. They stopped at a secluded lane. Halliwell spoke further. He then directed officers to a field in Gloucestershire, a flat, unremarkable stretch of farmland. There, after digging, police found the skeletal remains of a young woman who had been there for 8 years. It was later confirmed to be Becky Godden Edwards. Halliwell had, in a single afternoon, confessed to 2 murders and led police to both bodies. For Steve Fulcher, it felt like the most significant achievement of his career. For the legal process, it was the beginning of a disaster. The no-comment interview. After being taken to the field in Gloucestershire, Halliwell was finally formally processed. He was taken to the police station. He was cautioned. He was offered a solicitor. He accepted the solicitor. And when Fulcher next sat across from him in a formal interview room, with recording equipment running and all the requirements of pay satisfied, Halliwell answered every single question with the same 2 words: no comment. He said nothing more. He provided nothing further. He had already given Fulcher everything he was going to give, and he had given it in a setting that his lawyers would immediately challenge as legally inadmissible. This is a tactic. This is what Halliwell did that was described, in the years that followed, as calculated and sickening. By engaging with Fulcher in an environment that breached pace, by confessing and showing locations of 2 bodies in circumstances that he knew, or later exploited the knowledge of, could be legally challenged, Halliwell had created a situation in which the most powerful evidence of his guilt might be stripped away from the prosecution. He then went completely silent in the formal interview, ensuring that no admissible confession existed. He had protected himself with his cooperation. Whether Halliwell understood the legal implications of what he was doing in the field that afternoon is something investigators have debated. Some believe he was simply an intelligent and controlled person who intuitively grasped that informal confessions to an uncautioned officer were vulnerable to challenge. Others believe that the legal strategy came later, that his defense team identified the pace breach and built their case around it after the fact. What is not in doubt is the outcome. The confessions obtained without caution were challenged in court, and they were ruled inadmissible. The legal catastrophe, pace, and the inadmissible confessions. In January 2012, High Court Judge Mrs. Justice Cox examined the circumstances under which Halliwell's confessions had been obtained. Her ruling was, in her own words, about breaches that were wholesale and irretrievable. Fulcher had not read Halliwell his rights. He had not given him access to a solicitor. He had continued to question him after it became clear that the case was a murder, not a missing person. He had knowingly breached pace. He later admitted this openly in court, and his reasons, however sympathetic, did not give him the legal authority to do so. Justice Cox ruled that Halliwell's confessions were inadmissible as evidence. This meant that the prosecution had no admissible confession for the murder of Becky Godden Edwards. They had no independent physical evidence that could connect Halliwell to Becky, nothing that had been properly preserved and tested at that point. The charge of murdering Becky was dropped. Halliwell appeared at Bristol Crown Court in October 2012, changed his plea to guilty for the murder of Shauna Callahan, where DNA evidence independent of the confession existed, and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. He was not sentenced for Becky Godden's murder. Her death received no formal legal acknowledgement in that courtroom. Her family sat outside the system, legally excluded from any official process of justice for the killing of their daughter. Karen Edward described the outcome with a directness that cut through all the legal complexity. Her daughter had been murdered. The police knew who had done it. The man who had done it had shown them where her body was, and he was not being punished for it. Steve Fulcher, the detective who ended his own career. The consequences for Steve Fulcher were severe. He was reported to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. An investigation found that he had a case to answer for gross misconduct. In January 2014, a disciplinary tribunal found him guilty of gross misconduct for breaching pace and for ignoring force orders. He was given a final written warning. In May 2014, he resigned from Wiltshire Police. His career of more than 20 years was over. Fulcher has spoken and written extensively about his decision. In 2017, he published a book titled Catching a Serial Killer, My Hunt for Murderer Christopher Halliwell, in which he defended his actions as morally correct even if procedurally wrong. He argued that his primary obligation was to a potentially living young woman, not to procedural requirements designed for different circumstances. He pointed out that his decision to continue the conversation after Sean's body was found, the decision that led directly to the discovery of Becky Godden, was motivated by the desire to give Becky's family an answer, not by any personal interest. The response to Fulcher's treatment was divided. Among the families of the victims, especially Karen Edwards, he was a hero. Karen has said publicly that if Fulcher had followed pace to the letter, Becky's remains would never have been found, and her family would never have known what had happened to her daughter. She has campaigned actively for changes to the laws around arrest procedure to prevent similar situations in future. Among legal professionals and civil liberties advocates, the assessment was more complex. The rules that Fulcher broke exist to protect all people from police who might use interrogation without legal safeguard to produce unreliable confessions. The rules cannot be suspended simply because the officer involved happens to be acting in good faith. After leaving the police, Fulcher went to work as a security and policing consultant in Somalia. The second investigation, building the case without a confession, fresh eyes, and persistent evidence. After Halliwell's 2012 conviction for Shauna Callahan's murder, Wiltshire police faced the task of building a prosecutable case for Becky Godden's murder without using any of the evidence obtained during Fulcher's uncautioned interaction with Halliwell. That meant no confession, no directions to the field, and, initially, no physical evidence strong enough to stand on its own. The case was reassigned to a new senior investigating officer, Detective Superintendent Sean Memory. Memory approached the investigation methodically, recognizing that the path to a second conviction would require patient, thorough work building an independent evidential foundation. He began reviewing everything, every exhibit, every record, every account from the days around the time of Becky's death in early 2003. The Independent Office of Police Conduct later found, in a September 2022 report, that the investigation between 2011 and 2014 had been seriously inadequate, that reasonable lines of inquiry were not pursued, key evidence was not forensically examined, and no one in Wiltshire Police had taken proper responsibility for ensuring the inquiry progressed. An inexperienced detective inspector had been placed in sole charge of a complex murder investigation without adequate supervision, resources, or governance. The IOPC identified multiple specific missed opportunities from the early period after Halliwell's arrest. But eventually, through the harder work of Memory's team, the case began to come together. Each piece of evidence was small. Together, they formed something solid. The spade in the shed. Among the items seized from Halliwell's former home in Swindon in 2011 was a spade found in his garden shed. The spade had been taken as an exhibit, but it had not initially been subjected to sufficiently detailed forensic testing. When investigators returned to it years later and sent soil samples from the spade to a specialist forensic laboratory for analysis, the results were striking. The soil on the spade matched the specific profile of the soil from the field in Gloucestershire where Becky Godden Edwards had been buried. The distinctive mineral and organic composition of the soil in that field, particular to that specific location, was present on the blade of a spade found in the garden shed of the man who had shown police where Becky was buried. It was a kind of quiet, physical evidence that does not make headlines but wins cases. No drama, no confession, just soil on a spade, tested by science, telling a story that was consistent only with one explanation. The person who used the spade had been in that field. The RAC driver and the GP record. Investigators returned to the RAC record that had been known since 2011, the note of a breakdown call-out in the early hours of the 3rd of January 2003, 6 miles from the burial site. This time, they tracked down the RAC recovery driver and obtained a full witness statement. They corroborated it with additional evidence about Halliwell's location and movements that night. They also fully developed the evidence from Halliwell's GP visit on the same date, the severe scratches on his face, the injured hand, the explanation about a violent passenger. Taken together with the RAC record, the soil evidence from the spade, and the overall timeline, these pieces created an independent evidential narrative. Halliwell had been in the area that night, had sustained injuries consistent with a violent struggle, and had a spade that had been in the field where Becky was buried. Halliwell's offer, rejected. During the period when Detective Superintendent Memory was building the case, he visited Halliwell in prison. Halliwell indicated that he was prepared to make a deal, to provide information or a formal admission in exchange for some kind of consideration or arrangement. Memory declined. The investigation would not be built on deals with convicted murderer. It would be built on evidence, assembled properly and presented in a court of law. Memory's refusal of the deal was a statement about the kind of prosecution he was building, one that did not depend on Halliwell cooperation and could not be threatened or weakened by Halliwell's withdrawal of it. The trial and the whole life order, September 2016. Christopher Halliwell's trial for the murder of Becky Godden Edwards began at Bristol Crown Court in September 2016. The prosecution presented the case built entirely on independent physical and circumstantial evidence: the soil analysis of the spade, the RAC record, the GP record documenting injuries consistent with a struggle on the night of the murder, the overall timeline connecting Halliwell to the area, and expert testimony about the nature of the burial and the forensic evidence found with Becky's remains. Halliwell did not testify in his own defense. He gave no evidence. His legal team challenged the prosecution's case, but without a compelling alternative explanation for the soil on the spade, the injuries on the 3rd of January, 2003, and the circumstantial web of evidence the prosecution had assembled, the challenge was limited. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. On the 19th of September, 2016, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. Christopher Halliwell was convicted of the murder of Becky Godden Edwards. The judge then delivered the sentence that had not been available in 2012, when Halliwell had received a 25-year minimum for Sean's murder. In light of the second conviction, and in light of the gravity of the 2 murders, a pattern of predatory killing directed at vulnerable women, the court imposed a whole life order. This is the most severe sentence available under English law. It means exactly what it says. Halliwell will never be released. He will die in prison. In the courtroom that day, Karen Edwards, Becky's mother, who had waited 13 years for this moment, was present. She had been present through all of it: the years of not knowing, the discovery of Becky's remains, the legal catastrophe of the inadmissible confession, the years of inadequate investigation, the patient rebuilding of the case, and now this. The verdict she heard in that courtroom was not simply a legal outcome. It was, after everything, the acknowledgement that her daughter's life had mattered, that someone was being held accountable for taking it. What else? The unanswered questions of the trophy collection. The approximately 60 items of women's clothing and accessories found in the pond at Ramsbury represent, for investigators and the families of missing women across Britain, one of the most troubling unanswered questions in the entire case. If Halliwell murdered only 2 women, why did he have 60 items of women's belongings hidden in the pond? Are those items trophies from other victims? Do they belong to women who were assaulted but survived? Or were some of them collected in other ways? Police have investigated. Some items have been connected to identified individuals. Others have not. The question of how many victims Christopher Halliwell actually had, beyond the 2 convictions, remains genuinely open. Former Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher has written that he believes Halliwell had been killing for decades before the 2 murders for which he was convicted, and that the trophy collection points toward a much larger number of victims. True crime writers Bethan Truman and Chris Clark, in their book The New Millennium Serial Killer, present research linking Halliwell to over 20 unsolved cases of missing and murdered women in areas where he was known to have worked, lived, or traveled. Sally and John and other missing women. One specific case that investigators have looked at is that of Sally and John, a sex worker from Swindon who disappeared in September 1995 and has never been found. Fulcher, in his 2017 book, wrote that after apprehending Halliwell, he ordered a reopening of the investigation into Sally and John's disappearance, believing Halliwell may have been responsible. Detective Superintendent Memory, the officer who led the successful Becky Godden prosecution, also expressed concern that there were likely other victims. Speaking to the BBC, Memory said, "I'm definitely concerned." None of these additional suspicions have resulted in formal charges. Without confessions and without bodies, the evidential standard required for prosecution is very difficult to reach. Christopher Halliwell, sitting on a whole life sentence with nothing left to lose, has shown no inclination to provide any further information. He said no comment in his first formal interview in 2011, and silence has served him well ever since. The law, the lessons, and the legacy should pace have been broken. The debate about what Steve Fulcher should have done on that hill fort and in the Oxfordshire field in March 2011 has never been fully resolved, and it probably never will be. There are 2 genuinely important values in direct conflict, and neither can simply override the other. On one side, a young woman might have been alive. Every second counted. The formal procedure would have introduced delays. A man who was talking might, once cautioned and given access to a lawyer, stop talking entirely. The moral imperative to save a life, if there was any chance of saving one, seems to override procedural requirements that were not designed with this specific scenario in mind. Becky Godden's mother, whose daughter was found as a direct result of Fulcher's rule-breaking, is unequivocal. He was right. On the other side, The Police and Criminal Evidence Act exists precisely because history is full of cases in which people, including innocent people, were coerced or manipulated into confessions during informal, unrecorded conversations with police officers who believed they knew what the truth was. The rules are not optional for police officers whenever they personally decide the circumstances justify abandoning them. If officers can bypass pace whenever they consider their cause sufficiently important, the protection the Act provides dissolves. Halliwell, it should be noted, was not innocent, but the rules cannot be applied only to the guilty. Karen Edwards has campaigned for changes to the law that would allow what she calls urgent interviews in circumstances like the one Fulcher faced, situations where the possibility of saving a life is real and where the formal process creates a dangerous delay. The campaign has not yet produced legislative change, but it has kept the question alive in public debate. The media and cultural footprint. In September 2019, ITV broadcast A Confession, a 6-part drama series based on the case. It starred Martin Freeman as Steve Fulcher and Joe Absalom as Christopher Halliwell. Imelda Staunton played Karen Edwards, Becky's mother. The drama was widely praised for its restraint and accuracy, and it introduced the case to a much wider public audience than the original news coverage had reached. It depicted the central moral dilemma, Fulcher's decision at Barberry Castle and its consequences, with genuine nuance, presenting neither Fulcher nor the legal system that punished him as simply right or wrong. The Netflix documentary To Catch a Serial Killer, which also covers the case and in which journalist Robert Murphy appears as an interviewee, has given the story an international audience. The case is now studied in law schools and criminal justice programs as a case study in the tension between rule following and moral outcomes, between procedure and justice. Halliwell himself, sentenced to die in prison, has maintained his silence. He has offered deals. He has refused interviews. He is, by every account, unchanged from the controlled, calculating person who sat in that formal interview room in 2011 and said no comment to every question until the tape ran out. Conclusion: 2 women, 1 killer, and a system tested to its limits. Becky Godden Edwards was 20 years old when Christopher Halliwell murdered her and buried her in a Gloucestershire field. She lay there for 8 years. When she was finally found, the circumstances of that finding meant that the man who had killed her could not initially be prosecuted. When he was eventually convicted, 13 years after her death, the conviction came from a spade in a shed and a broken-down car and a doctor's record of scratches on her face. Shauna Callahan was 22 years old when Halliwell picked her up on a Swindon street in the early hours of the morning and drove her to her death. She had been missing for 6 days. A detective broke the rules trying to find her. She was found, but not alive. The rule breaking that found her body and found Becky's grave also ensured that a charge for Becky's murder was initially dismissed. The same decision that gave Karen Edwards her daughter back temporarily took away her right to see her daughter's killer punished. Christopher Halliwell is serving a whole life sentence. He will not leave prison. His tactic, using the uncautioned confession of Becky's murder as both a demonstration of cooperation and a legal time bomb planted in the heart of the prosecution, very nearly worked. It delayed justice for Becky Godden by 5 years and cost Steve Fulcher his career. It showed a level of calculation and legal awareness that investigators found and continue to find deeply disturbing. The deeper questions the case raises about how society values different women's lives, about what happens when good people break rules for good reasons, about how many other women may have been killed by this man, and how we will ever find out, have not been answered. They remain open, uncomfortable, and important. 2 women were murdered. 1 man has been held accountable. Whether that is a full extent of the accountability that is owed remains for the families of many other missing women whose clothing may lie at the bottom of a Wiltshire pond, the question they cannot stop asking. The 2 confirmed victims. Becky Godden Edwards, born the 12th of June 1982 in Swindon, 20 years old at the time of her murder. Last seen alive in January 2003, getting into a taxi outside a Swindon nightclub. Her remains were found in March 2011 in a field in Gloucestershire after Halliwell led detectives to the location. She was identified through forensic analysis. Christopher Halliwell was convicted of a murder on the 19th of September 2016 and received a whole life sentence. Shauna Callahan, born the 26th of February 1989 in Swindon, 22 years old at the time of her murder. Last seen alive on the night of the 18th of March 2011, leaving Suju nightclub in Swindon's Old Town. She got into Christopher Halliwell's taxi. Her body was found on the 24th of March 2011 in a shallow grave near Uffington, Oxfordshire. She had likely died from head injuries. Halliwell pleaded guilty to her murder on the 19th of October 2012 and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years.